Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is April 24th. On this day in 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. stood trial in South Carolina, accused of murdering two young white girls. By the end of that day, yes, that same day, he had been convicted and sentenced to death. Today, we're going to talk about George Stinney, the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. We'll also discuss how decades later his case would resurface, not just as a tragic story, but as a symbol of racial injustice and a broken system. Let's get started. It was March 23rd, 1944, in Dalcolu, South Carolina, a segregated mill town where the black and white communities lived completely separate lives. That afternoon, two white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, went out riding their bikes and never came home. A search party was formed, and the next morning, their bodies were found in a ditch near the railroad tracks. Both had suffered blunt force trauma to their head. Brutal injuries that investigators believed were caused by railroad spikes or something similar. Shock rippled through the town, but what followed was not a thorough investigation. Instead, just hours after the girls were found, the suspicion landed squarely and almost instantly on George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old black boy who lived nearby. George and his little sister Amy had reportedly seen the girls that morning. They had stopped by the Stinney house asking about a certain type of flower. And that was it. A brief interaction about flowers. But for local authorities, that was all it took. The next day, George was taken from his home without a warrant. He was interrogated alone for hours without a lawyer and without his parents. He was 14. There was no transcript, no audio recording, no signed confession, just the word of the officers, who later claimed that George had confessed. According to them, George said that he had lured the girls into the woods and killed them. But the officers' accounts didn't even line up, and they never produced a shred of physical evidence. No murder weapon, no blood-stained clothing, nothing tying George to the crime scene. Still, George was charged with double homicide. His name and photo were in the newspaper the next day. His family, terrified for their own safety, was forced to flee Dalcolu, and George was left alone awaiting trial. On April 24th, 1944, just 31 days after his arrest, George was put on trial. He stood in the courtroom at barely 5 feet tall, weighing 95 pounds. He was tried as an adult in Clarendon County, a community so segregated that black residents weren't even allowed inside the courtroom unless they were testifying. George's parents, still in hiding, weren't there. The entire trial, from jury selection to verdict, lasted one single day. All 12 jurors were white men selected that morning. No black citizens were considered for the jury. George's defense attorney, Charles Plowden, was a court-appointed lawyer with no experience at handling capital cases. He didn't ask for more time, he didn't file any motions, and most troubling of all, he didn't call a single witness in George's defense. He didn't even question the so-called confession. He didn't bring up George's age, and he didn't present any evidence to suggest his client's innocence. The prosecution leaned entirely on that unverified confession, along with speculation. They claimed that George had lured the girls away, though there were no eyewitnesses, no forensic evidence, and, again, no murder weapon. But after both sides rested, the jury deliberated for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That's how long it took to decide the fate of a 14-year-old child. After that 10 minutes of deliberation, George Stinney Jr. was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death by electrocution. And just like that, a child was headed to death row. Just under 2 months later, on June 16, 1944, George was executed by the state of South Carolina. He had spent those final weeks alone in an adult prison with no visitors, no chance for appeal, and no real legal defense. His attorney made no effort to intervene. No one stepped in to question the speed or the fairness of the trial. That morning, George was reportedly quiet. The guards later said that he was polite, though clearly terrified. He hadn't seen his family since the day he was arrested. The electric chair at the prison was built for adults. It was built for grown men. George was so small that officials had to sit him on a stack of books just to align him properly. Some say one of those books was the Bible. Others say it was simply a makeshift booster. As the execution began, witnesses reported a horrific scene. The mask placed over George's face slipped off after the first jolt of electricity, exposing his young face to everyone in the room. His expression twisted in pain and fear. He was declared dead at 7:30 a.m. George had gone from arrest to execution in 83 days. For years, George's story was rarely told outside of South Carolina, but among civil rights activists and members of the Black community, it was remembered as a tragic emblem of Jim Crow-era justice. A child convicted without evidence, denied a defense, and silenced by a system that never saw him as innocent. It wasn't until decades later in the 80s and 90s that George's name began to surface in national conversations about juvenile justice, the death penalty, and wrongful convictions. His sister Amy, who had seen the girls that day and stood by George's side during that brief interaction about flowers, never stopped defending him. She spoke of how George loved to ride bikes, how he was gentle and bookish. He was no killer. And they were both home the entire afternoon of the murders. In 2013, a group of attorneys, historians, and activists filed a motion to reopen the case. They wanted George's conviction vacated, arguing that the trial had been fundamentally unfair, a violation of everything that the Constitution promises. And finally, in December 2014, a South Carolina judge agreed. Judge Carmen Mullen issued a ruling that vacated George Stinney's conviction, stating plainly that his due process rights had been grossly violated. She wrote, quote, "It is clear to this court that the confession obtained from the defendant was not voluntary, and that a violation of the defendant's procedural due process rights resulted in a fundamentally unfair trial," end quote. George Stinney's name was cleared 70 years after his death. However, no one else has ever been tried for Betty and Mary's murders. There have been rumors about possible perpetrators over the years, but the girls' families remain convinced that Stinney was their killer, though they do agree that he probably didn't get a fair trial. George's story has been taught in classrooms, dramatized in plays and films, and used as a reference point in legal discussions about death penalty, race, and the treatment of minors in the justice system. His name has become a symbol, not just of what went wrong, but of what still needs to change. At just 14 years old, George Stinney Jr. was executed by a system that never gave him a chance. No evidence, no real defense, no appeal. But decades later, his story continues to remind us of the dangers of rushing to judgment and failing to see the humanity in every accused person, especially a child. George Stinney's short life and the injustice that he faced have left a lasting impact on how we view race, the law, and the treatment of children in America's legal system. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found George's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!